Good evening, Brentwood family. My name is Travis Walters. This is our Wednesday evening Bible study on July the 15th. And we're going to start today talking about the book of Jonah. We have a 4-week series. There are 4 chapters in Jonah, so that makes it pretty easy to cover one chapter each evening as we go through this study over about the next month. Now, the book of Jonah really gives us the opportunity to see just how compassionate our God is. He is gracious and he is merciful. And sometimes we have heard that the Old Testament God is a little different than the New Testament God. But here in Jonah especially, we see that that's not the case, that God is unchanging over time. And secondly, we learn from the book of Jonah that God in his will is certain. He is sovereign, and what he wants and his wishes and his will ultimately prevail in our lives, whether we want it to or not. So let's dig in to the book of Jonah, and hopefully you will find this to be helpful as I have found it to me. This is not some guy who is far away, distant many centuries ago, but he and his story has a lot of applicability to our lives today. So if you'll open with me in your Bibles to Jonah chapter 1, we'll begin reading. Jonah chapter 1 verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai. Go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it, because its wickedness has come up before me." But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. So, first of all, we have to set a little background here as we begin the book of Jonah. From 2 Kings, we learn that Jonah is a prophet that lived in the 8th century BC. He lived during the reign of Rehoboam II, which is approximately 786 BC to 746 BC. So for me, I have to kind of remind myself about where that falls into Scripture. So, gone are the great kings of old, Saul, David, Solomon. All of them are gone. Solomon died around 930 BC, and the kingdom was split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, 10 tribes went with the north, 2 went with the south. And then over the course of the next few hundred years, there were good kings in the north and good kings in the south and bad kings in the north and bad kings in the south. And that's the backdrop through which we see Jonah. Now, ultimately, in 722 BC, a nation called the Assyrians, which we're going to talk a lot more about in a minute, come and wipe out the northern kingdom and use deportation to basically wipe it off the face of the map as they send the citizens of the northern kingdom throughout the Assyrian Empire. And then fast forward another 150 years, in 586 BC, the kingdom of Judah is conquered by the Babylonians and the temple is destroyed. So we are in that in-between time when the greatness of Israel is gone, and yet we are before the time where the Assyrians destroy the northern kingdom. So here we see that the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and everything really in our lives should start with the word of the Lord. That's why we have to read the Bible. That's why we are praying to hear and seek what the word of the Lord is for us. For the word of the Lord came to Jonah, and he decided that instead of doing and responding to what the Lord said, he decided that he was going to run away. Now, one of the things that we can do sitting in our Sunday school classes, sitting in our homes, sipping our coffee on a Sunday morning, we go, hey, we're all Christians here. Wouldn't it have been of a good idea? Shouldn't Jonah have obeyed the Lord? Well, we have to ask ourselves, why didn't he? And a lot of times we can be very judgmental without fully understanding where folks are coming from, especially when they live in a different culture and a different time than us. So why on earth would Jonah, as a prophet of God, a guy who has dedicated himself up to this point to listening to God, doing what God says, and then proclaiming God's truths to others, why would he run away? Well, the first reason that really, and perhaps the most important one, why he ran away was because God asked him to do something very hard. And sometimes we can think that, hard things come from Satan, they come from evil, they come from bad things in our lives, and good things, easy things, those type of things come from God. No, sometimes hard things come from God. Sometimes we are told to do hard things. Sometimes we're asked to go into the breach and do a very difficult thing. And that's indeed what Jonah did. Because if we look at where the city of Nineveh is, Nineveh was the capital of the sworn enemy of the Israelites, the Assyrians. In fact, in multiple occasions, the Assyrians tried, before they were successful, to wipe Israel off the map. And we find that really, where is Nineveh today? Anybody know? All right, it is in the northern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. Now, you may remember from modern history, Mosul sits on the Tigris River. Well, the ancient city of Nineveh sit in about the same place on the other side of the banks of the Tigris in ancient times, this great city of 120,000 or more people. And this capital city is pointed out to us in Nahum chapter 3 as a city of blood that God really stood against in its evil. They are condemned for their murder, for their witchcraft, for their prostitution. This is a terrible and bad place. Get the image of bodies piled up in the streets because there's so much murder, something that we probably can't even fathom today. So literally, the great-great-granddads of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, that's the people that God said he wanted Jonah to go preach against. Now, interesting thing is that really the Assyrians were those people in ancient history that I would argue perhaps had the first great army, the first great conquering army in ancient history, and the first truly great empire that spanned a large area. And they were certainly among those in those early days that achieved that. And they were really known for their ruthlessness and their terror. So any who resisted their conquering, they met with two things, and they had a systematic Assyrian policy of this is the way they operated. Any who resisted met with great physical punishment once conquered, and then secondly, they met with deportation on a massive scale. So the Assyrians not only kind of operated via terror, but they were really doing psychological warfare. So what they would do, someone would resist, a city, a town, a region, and after they were conquered, which almost always for a few hundred years, the Assyrians prevailed time and again. They would march in, they would take the chief leaders in the city, and they would do such awful things as dismemberment. They'd cut off arms and feet and hands and noses and ears. They would skin people alive and drape their skins over pillars. They would behead people. And of course, they would violate the women. And then with their policy of deportation, they would enslave the children, carry them off to other places to work in the Assyrian Empire based on their skill set and craft. And really, the Assyrians were masters at psychological warfare. And Jonah had to have known this. He had to be well aware. So really, when God asked him to do this, I am confident that what ran through Noah's mind was, God is sentencing me to death. I am to go to Nineveh and tell those people that they're wrong, and all they're going to do is kill me, and perhaps even worse, make me suffer greatly before I die for calling them out. So we want to be a little bit gracious and a little bit compassionate to Noah, because I put myself in his shoes, And I probably would have done the same thing faced with the same call from the Lord. Now, secondly, I think it's probably important to say that Noah's life plans did not match up with God's life plans for him. Noah, in a very real way, said, "There are some things, God, that you are welcome to speak into my life about. There are other things that you are not." Perhaps in Noah's life plans, he had a vision of comfort over commitment. He was happy to be a prophet, to talk locally about God, as long as he could go to his home at night, sleep in his own bed, be around his own people. He was fine with it. Have any of you found that you value comfort over commitment? I tell you, as I get older, I like my bed, I like my house, I like my creature comforts. When I was young, as I was going out to do Boy Scout stuff and did the Eagle Scout thing, and then spent a lot of time doing difficult things early on in the military, man, I look back and go, man, those were a lot of nights of sleeping on the ground, and I miss being at home with my creature comforts. Perhaps Jonah was thinking the same thing. And today we can get in that mindset of not doing the hard things of what God calls us to do because we're just too comfortable, especially here in the United States of America. Now, finally, and there are many reasons why Jonah probably ran, but I'm giving you probably the top few. Finally, I'd point out that sin makes us stupid. You know, when we look at running away from God, that is in essence what we do when we sin. And God is omnipresent. He is everywhere all the time. There is literally no way that we can put space between God and us, that He is seeking us, He is pursuing us, He is everywhere all the time. Running from God is just silly. But that's indeed what Noah chooses to do. And I know there have been many times in my life where I have just done stupid things because I had a sinful heart or sinful intent or a malice about me. You know, I also am just looking at a map and am a little bit confused because Jonah, instead of just doing what God asked him to do, going hundreds of miles away to Nineveh, he decided instead to go thousands of miles in the exact opposite direction toward Tarshish. So he had to be pretty creative in his sin to decide that he was going to do something that maybe would have ended up being, on the journey at least, a lot further away, a lot rougher road to travel. So we can do the same thing in our stupidity when it comes to sin. We sometimes have to be very creative in order to get away with things. We have people that we're allied with, when we have extra things that we have to do to keep secrets. Those kind of things are literally where Noah is acting, or Jonah rather is acting in a silly way, and sometimes we do the same thing. So let's keep reading. He says that Jonah, the Bible says Jonah went down to Joppa where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. You know, I think sometimes we can think, hey, you know, there's a hard thing in front of me. There's something that I just don't want to do that maybe God has asked me to do. And we find a ship and we go, hey, look, it's God's ship. God has given me a way out. But I'm here to tell you that if you're looking for a way out of God's will for your life, there'll always be a ship. It's just not God's ship. It's Satan's shipwreck, where in a very real way, we don't take God's ship, we take Satan's shipwreck. If we say we are having financial problems, and then we say, oh, look at work. There's a way where I can maybe steal some things in order to better my own financial situation. That's not God's ship, that's Satan's shipwreck. If we see, hey, as single people, we're lonely. Oh, look, here's an unbeliever I can date. That's not God's ship. That is God's shipwreck. That is Satan's shipwreck, rather. And so there are times where if we want to find a way out to escape and run away from God, we'll always find a ship. It just may not be God's ship. Well, we keep reading. We find that in chapter 1, verse 4, it said, God sent a great wind on the sea. Such a violent storm rose up, and the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. Now, you know, when you're on a boat full of experienced sailors, and they're afraid, that you're in a world of hurt. If I'm ever on an airplane and I'm sitting next to a pilot, and me myself as a military pilot, almost never am I scared. If I start to get scared, then Dorothy sitting beside me, she starts to get scared because she knows that something's probably not right if the pilot's sitting in the back and is scared. Same thing with these sailors. We also find that it's bad when the sailors are literally throwing their business, throwing their profits overboard in an effort to save themselves. Basically, if you just think about taking $100 bills and throwing them out the window as you're driving down the interstate, that's literally what the sailors are doing. So this storm must have been absolutely terrifying. We keep reading. We find that Jonah, though, had gone below deck, and he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him in verse 6 and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he'll take notice of us and we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots and find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell to Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us who is responsible for making all this trouble for us. What do you do? Where do you come from? Who is your country? From what people are you?" He answered, "I am a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" And Jonah replied, "Pick me up, throw me into the sea." He replied, "It will become calm, and I know that this is my fault. This great storm has come upon you." Now, it's important to note that sometimes, just like in Jonah's situation here, we are responsible for our own downfall, our own troubles, our own misery. Jonah is in this situation because he willfully chose to disobey God, and it's very painful. But how about the sailors? The sailors didn't disobey God. The sailors aren't running from the God. They just woke up that morning, went to their jobs, get all out on the sea like they've done many times before to make their livelihood. It's important to note that our sin impacts other people. There have been times in my life where I've had to look at my parents, my wife, my kids, my friends, and say, "Hey, I'm sorry, my sin is impacting you, is hurting you," and I can see that firsthand, and it's devastating. Jonah looks across the boat here, and finally, in a moment of surrender, he tells them what to do. He said, "This is my fault." And it's important for us to ask, I think, as we go through our lives, who's on your boat? The sailors put Jonah on their boat, and in that moment, at that time, that was not a good call because he was going in a direction that was going to have significant impact and a negative one on their lives. So who's on your boat? Who's in your phone right now that maybe you need to get rid of? Young men and women that maybe have influences that are not great in your life. Who do we need to kind of push away? So the story continues, and the men on the boat said in verse 13, they said, "Instead of throwing him overboard like he told them to, the men did their best to row back to land. But they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried to the Lord, "O Lord, please do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, O Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. But the Lord provided a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was inside the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So, interestingly enough, Jonah is caught in a storm. And until Jonah decides to change his heart, to take a different course, the storm grows ever wilder, ever worsening. And some of us today, some of you right now, are caught in a storm. And if you're not caught in a storm right now, you're either have just left a crisis, you're either caught in a crisis like I just mentioned, or that storm is somewhere in the not too distant future, because that's just how, unfortunately, life is. The divorce papers have been signed. The child is sick. It's cancer. You've lost your job. You don't have enough money to pay your bills. COVID-19 is just not something that's out there. Now it's in your house. Now your loved one's about to die. There are so many different things that cause storms in our lives. You've been betrayed. They don't want to be friends with you anymore. The breakup was hard. And for some of us that are there right now, we have to ask ourselves, what do we do when the storm is heartbreaking, when it's heart-wrenching, when there are times where we just don't know where else to turn? And sometimes those storms are caused by our own doing, just like Jonah. Other times it's the sins of others, or it's just happenstance, bad luck, just the way life goes in a fallen world, just like the sailors, where they're caught in a storm. And Jonah tried to run away from God and kept running away from God. The sailors tried to row against God, but not until surrender did the storm calm. So Jonah, in verse 12, tells the sailors what to do. He says, "Pick me up, throw me in." It's a true moment of surrender. He says, "Enough, Lord. I know that whether I live or die, I am just going to completely surrender to you." Isn't that hard? Man, it's so hard for me. I want so much to be in control, to be the master and commander of my own fate. But there are many, many times where I learn that that is just not so. And those storms can be hard, and those storms can be terrible, but those storms can be a moment of grace and mercy in my life if I just learn in that moment to surrender, just like Jonah did. And just like eventually the sailors did. They tried to row, it got worse. It is exhausting to try to work against the will of God, and that's what the sailors found out. They rowed and they rowed and they rowed, and Jonah ran and ran and ran. And at the end of all that, they were just exhausted, utterly worn out. And then surrender occurs. Jonah says, "Throw me into the sea." He says, "Whether I live, whether I die, I am surrendering myself to the Lord." And when we do that, when I have done that, we ask different questions. Instead of asking ourselves, "Why, Lord, why is this happening to me? Why is this pain and suffering? What have I done to deserve it?" All those questions change when we truly surrender to the Lord God Almighty and His will for our life. Instead, we ask ourselves in a much more quiet and solemn place, Lord, what do you want me to become during this storm? Who do you want me to be on the other side of this storm? How do you want me to witness to others as a result of this storm? You see the difference? Man, it's easy to say, hard to do. But fighting against the will of God, against his great plan and purposes for our lives, as Jonah did, is truly a futile effort and very detrimental to us. So my question for you as we look at Jonah chapter 1 is this: does God have the right to speak into every nook and cranny, every day, every little place in your life? Or are there some places where you have decided that God is not welcome? Bless my finances, God, but don't talk about my job, and don't talk maybe about my relationships. I want you to definitely give me God-fearing kids, Lord, but don't talk about what I'm doing on Saturday nights. Let's just focus on what happens when I'm sitting in the pew on Sunday mornings. Does God have the right to control your life? I'm entitling this sermon series, this little study here, Who's the Boss? Because that's what we see with Jonah, is God deciding what happens in our lives and we being submissive to that. And as we see with Jonah, being asked to do hard things, sometimes following God is definitely challenging. So as we get ready to conclude today, chapter 1, we're going to talk about the fish next week and have a time to talk about how God brings us through tough times and what that looks like. I really encourage you to join us. Let's go to our Father in prayer and as we conclude tonight. Father in heaven, so thankful for this day and thankful for Jonah and the story of his life. Pray that you would help convict our hearts for the places that we have not surrendered to you. Some of us right now are in storms. We're in terrible storms. We are being beat down by the wind and the rain. We are trying to row against you. We are trying to run away from you because that's what all of us have done at one time or another. Convict us in our hearts, Lord, to surrender to you because you are a great God. You are a good God. And you are a God that loves us. Even in the worst storms, help those storms to be filled with your grace and your mercy so that we can see with spiritual eyes and know that when we surrender to you, there is no better place to be than in your presence. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.